Hello. Some of you may know that my background is in nursing, and then I later went on to develop fibromyalgia and ultimately to recover to be where I am now as a recovery specialist. And what I wanted to come online to talk to you about today was the role that my nurse training, my experience as a nurse played in actually helping me to get out of fibromyalgia. I've talked elsewhere, and I'll put links at the bottom of this video to my webinar with the chrysalis effect, where I talked about why nurses are particularly prone to developing chronic exhaustion. But I think it's important too to look at the positive side. And I really think that I probably wouldn't have recovered and I wouldn't be here where I am now if I hadn't actually had that nursing background, which gave me the tools and the understanding to keep searching for answers. And more fundamentally, the hope that it was worth putting that energy in and keeping going, even when I couldn't see the way forward. I always felt that there was hope. And if I'd got myself into fibromyalgia, there must be a way out as well, regardless of what the doctors were saying. So how does that link into my nurse training? Well, I was incredibly privileged, I think, to do my undergraduate nursing training in the late 80s and early 90s at the University of Edinburgh. And the department at that time, the reason why I chose it was in the School of Social Sciences. So we got an incredibly broad degree training at a time where in other schools, there was quite a strong focus on clinical, the medical, with schools being in the nursing schools being in medical faculties. Edinburgh was quite different and very much from the beginning taught us that we should be looking at the whole patient, a holistic approach to nursing, and not breaking them down, falling into that trap of going to wash the legs in bed 23 or whatever else, which sometimes was a way that nurses spoke about patients. They just talked about, the hernia in bed 2 or the diabetic in bed 3. So we were really taught to use evidence-based practice, medical principles, scientific principles, but to always, always see the patient as a whole person, which is very much the approach that I take in my work as a recovery specialist now. As a student nurse at the University of Edinburgh, I was socialising with other medical students and people across a wide range of different health professions, which meant that I was really getting to know some of the medical students. And I remember one of the things I noticed was that in first year, they would be very keen to talk to us as nurses. And we were operating on very much a kind of par as intellectual equals. But as the time went on, there was a strong tendency for medical students to distance themselves from us. And amongst some of them, a real arrogance, a sense that they were cleverer, more important, and that really we weren't worth talking to anymore. Obviously, not all of them. I have good friends still who are medics. But it was clear that they were being socialized into this role in which they expected to be the expert, to be listened to. Essentially, their word was final. And at the same time on the wards, we were learning unofficially, but it was referred to in class as well as the doctor-nurse game. And what that was what you do on a ward when your training, your knowledge, your gut instinct, everything about you as a nurse tells you what is going on for a patient and what they need, but the doctor hasn't seen it. Because the experience then is if you go to the doctor and you say, I think Mrs. So-and-so over there is probably developing a urine infection, they will get really upset because diagnosis is the doctor's job. So you would have to find a way around the houses to make them think about this. So ultimately they would think that it was their diagnosis. And I think that's a game that is played out between men and women in a lot of different settings. But again, I was learning that the doctor isn't always right. And sometimes the nurse knows better. And sometimes actually the expert in a situation is the patient. So I learned always to listen to the patients, especially when they were telling me that something wasn't normal for them. And that set me up later on when I became ill to question when I went to a GP. So if they referred me on to a specialist and the specialist, for example, a cardiologist said, we've done all the tests, we've examined them, there is no physical damage to your heart, I had no problem with accepting that at all. Because in certain areas, the doctors really do know best and they are amazing with the kind of the high tech and with acute medicine particularly. But I knew that with chronic conditions, medicine really struggled to find answers that weren't pharmaceutical. I went on to work as a community nurse in a GP practice, and what I saw there was GPs becoming increasingly frustrated with the people with chronic conditions who would come in time after time, sometimes with the same problem that the doctor couldn't solve, sometimes with a whole range of different problems. And then the doctors often began to, frustration would turn into blame, is that this person is just swinging their lead, they're hypochondriac, they can't possibly have all these different conditions, and would dismiss them. And as a community nurse, I found myself working with those people quite a lot because there was the scope within my practice at that time to have some say over who I visited and what I was doing. I didn't always have the answers, but I was listening to people. And that was clearly making a difference, actually validating their experience. I got very frustrated at the limitations of my practice as a nurse in being able to do more in these areas. So again, the message was that there are all areas of healthcare where doctors really don't have the answers. So when I went to my GP, who was a woman about my own age, and she got frustrated in the same way with me, I recognized that pattern. I recognized and I sympathized with her frustration that, oh, here's Alison again. Why don't you just go away and leave me? But she said to me, you just have to understand that middle-aged women ache. And I just really lost the plot with her. And I said to her, yes, of course, middle-aged women ache. I know that, but that's not because they're middle-aged. It's not inevitable when you reach middle age that you ache. If you think about what middle-aged women are doing, what they are coping with in our lives, the burdens we carry at work, looking after elderly parents, children, all of the barriers to normal life that women face, and the years of this that have built up, of course, elderly, I'm not elderly, middle-aged women, of course, middle-aged women ache. What do we do about it? And in that response, there were the seeds of understanding, and the work that I do now is, look at all of these underlying factors. Look at me as a human being and see all of the pressures I've been putting on my body that must be contributing to my illness. I got really frustrated because my training in biochemistry, in physiology and anatomy, my study of the hormonal system told me that my incredibly heavy periods and the problems that I had around that area were going to come from some sort of a hormonal imbalance. And yet I could not get the doctors to refer me to a hormone specialist. Looking back on it now, I don't think that would have been the answer, but it might have helped to get that bigger picture of me. Why were my hormones out of balance? And why was it that the doctors could only offer me hysterectomy or a womb ablation, which is actually what I had? And actually the womb ablation was an operation that contributed to my crash, because they did that within 6 weeks of taking out my tonsils. That's rather a lot for a human body that's already struggling to cope with. So my nursing training, all of the knowledge that I'd accumulated during my training, and that willingness to question doctors meant that instead of leaving my doctor's appointments feeling deflated and disempowered and going home and thinking, well, the doctors know best, I really just have to get on and adapt to this, however awful it is, I went home angry. I went home determined that come hell or high water, I was not going to live the rest of my life sitting on the sofa watching everybody else get on with their life. And I was going to find the answers. And it's that same drive and determination and confidence that there are answers out there that I see in clients now who do recover. And what really upsets me is when I talk to people who have just accepted at face value, quite reasonably in their experience, when a doctor has said to them, I don't have a cure for you, so I will send you to a pain clinic or a fatigue clinic where they will teach you how to cope with where you are now. But I also find it intensely frustrating because I have recovered. I did find the answers that I needed through the chrysalis effect. And I now understand very well exactly why I became ill, and I can help my clients understand why they've become ill. And we all have a different story. We all have different contributing factors, but there is such a powerful shared pattern of how we overburden ourselves over years and years and years until we reach the point where our systems tip over physically and start a whole cascade of interactions between our nervous system and our hormonal system, our muscles, our gut, all gets knocked out of balance and produces this apparently crazy set of symptoms that don't look as if they're connected. And that all came because I was a nurse. And so while I look back on nursing, and in some ways I wish I hadn't done it, because maybe I wouldn't have become ill. And I can blame nursing for making me ill. I'm also profoundly thankful for the gifts that I was given in a department where I'd not only learnt anatomy and physiology, clinical skills, but I learned how to think. So I did philosophy. I did the philosophy of health. I went on to do a PhD, so I studied research methodology. So I understand how you come to a scientific solution as to what's true and what's not. So when somebody says to me, recovery is not possible, recovery is not real, I have those tools to come back and say, I have recovered. I have tested my recovery to the maximum. So for me, recovery is absolutely real, and it only takes one example to prove that it's possible. So if it's possible for me, it's possible for other people as well. And the scientific response to that should not be, oh, well, you're an outlier. We don't really understand why some people recover, which you'll also hear. A real scientist will say, now, hang on a minute. Most people don't recover, but you did. How did you do that? What is it about you? And that's where we need more scientific research. And I think we need to move the emphasis away from looking down a microscope at little bits of people's bodies to looking at those much bigger patterns. What do people have in common who develop these conditions? And we can look at that across thousands of people to see statistically significant patterns. What is it about the people that we can find who have recovered? What have they done? What do they have in common? So we can do quantitative research that is rigorous and scientific, but doesn't have to be a randomized controlled trial. RCTs are not the only way in which you can study things. And I should know that because I have a PhD from the School in Health and Social Science at the University of Edinburgh. So I am trained as a researcher. But equally, you can do just as valid research using qualitative methods, which is what I did in my PhD. You go out and you ask people. And you talk to them about their symptoms. Instead of dismissing pain as subjective, we can't measure this, so it's not really worth studying. You talk to them about their experience of pain and what happens, and you can see patterns across people as well. You can find out things in qualitative interview studies that just are not possible if you're just looking at the numbers or just looking at a microscope. So I hope that helps you to start thinking about your own illness and whether you believe the doctors when they tell you that because they have no medical cure, there is no hope for you. So I would argue that the existence of even one person like me should give you hope that recovery is possible. And the existence of a whole program in the chrysalis effect, which was created by a recoverer who went out, did that scientific thing, talked to other recoverers to see what they'd done and built a program around it. The fact that that program is now working with particularly open-minded GP providers in the NHS to help other people and is providing measurable results to show that it works, that actually recovery is absolutely possible. But what it depends on is moving away from a model in which doctors do something to you to cure you and reframing it as healing. And that's the other thing that nursing gave me, is an understanding that to get better is not just about something that I as a nurse or a doctor did to the patient. So Florence Nightingale, way back at the beginning of modern nursing, argued that what happens when a patient heals is less about the cure. It's more about removing the barriers to that natural process. Your body actually wants to heal. Nature will, in the right circumstances, heal itself. And so she wrote that the nurse's job was to remove the barriers. So she wrote about the importance of good nutrition, of fresh air, of movement within the capabilities of where the patient was at that time. Removal of stress. Even back then, Florence recognised the importance of removing the stress from a patient so that they could focus on getting well. And being able to see outside, being in an atmosphere that makes you feel at ease. And research since then has shown actually that being recovering in a hospital room that has a view of trees statistically improves the speed of your recovery. And so this idea that your body has an innate urge and an ability to heal itself when you take away the things that are holding that down, really I've carried through from my nursing training and is the foundation of everything that I do now as a recovery specialist. So what I do with my clients is I help them to identify not just the symptoms and to do things that make them feel better, but to look underneath the symptoms and say, what's happened to you? What do you believe and what are you doing in your life that is so overwhelming you that your body is no longer functioning? And we can gradually pick away at that like leaves of, layers on an onion to gradually remove the barriers to healing. And it's amazing to watch as you do that, how people's symptoms begin to drop away. So just some food for thought today. I hope you've enjoyed that and maybe put some comments below.